The Resident Evil 4 remake has been insanely successful. It's been praised for how authentic it is to the original, as well as for the innovations it's made that differ from the original game. The bosses are a big part of this equation, but are they really even better than they were in the original? Today, that's what we're going to find out. Without further ado, let's get right into the video. Lago, the first boss in the game, was never really anything special, to say the least. It was cool for the time, but it wasn't anything to write home about. When I first played the remake about a week ago, it seemed to be a little more simple than the original was, at least for how I remembered it. Little did I know, though, the remake was actually far better than the original. I went back and played the original recently, and let me tell you, it was awful. The reticle was super annoying, and also the way Leon aims while he's holding it, it just didn't seem to match up with where the reticle was pointing at. So if you were aiming right at Lago, it would look like Leon was going to throw it to the left, which would kind of throw you off. The aiming and timing just seemed too fast for a game that has such clunky and slow movement. Don't get me wrong, the original Resident Evil 4 was really good, but by today's standards, the controls are a little dated. There are also an annoying amount of QuickTime events in this fight. The fact that you always had to spam square after getting smacked off after the shittily timed openings was pretty aggravating. It felt like the camera just went apeshit most of the time. The original was definitely more boring and just flat out aggravating than fun. The remake did what it could to salvage this fight. Even though this fight isn't anything special, it is iconic for Resident Evil 4, so they had to keep it in. It's still probably one of the worst fights in the remake, but they definitely did it justice by taking out all those annoying QuickTime events. The openings for attacks seem a little bit more forgiving than the original. Overall, the fight's still not great in the remake, but in the original it was far worse. I would say for the original side of things, I would give it a 2 out of 5 Leon heads. For the remake, I would give it a 3. You know, it's alright, nothing special, but it's there. You know, it's still cool they kept it in, it's a nice callback. It was okay, but there are far better bosses that you're going to hear about here in a minute. Let's see what the next boss has in store for us. Please excuse me for any mispronunciations throughout this video. It's gonna happen. The next boss fight is the Gigante. I actually found that in the original, the intro was way cooler and it made him seem far more menacing and out of control. But as for the boss fight, it was generally the same. But that's actually a good thing, seeing as it was already one of the best in the original RE4. It did, however, seem a bit shorter and less difficult in the original. And you also can't teabag him, which sucks. The scene where the dog comes to save your ass was actually way cooler in the remake though, so I'll give it that. In the original, he did rip apart the environment, but it seemed like it was on a whole other level in the remake. He just seemed a lot more menacing and scary. Like I said, the overall fight is pretty similar. They really just tightened the whole fight up and made it seem really cool. The remake version was a little harder, which made it a bit more of a challenge. But overall, the Gigante has always been an amazing fight. They didn't really need to change anything at all. They could have transferred over the original animations and everything and it still would have been pretty good. At least better than Lago. There's not really much else to compare with Gigante. They didn't really change much. So for Gigante, I would say in the original, it was a solid 4 out of 5 Leon heads. And the remake also gets 4 out of 5 Leon heads. You can't go wrong here. Let's move on to the next boss. Méndez is a super iconic boss in the original RE4, and the same goes for the remake. But he does have a pretty cool Discord mod fedora in the remake, which gives him extra points. Once again, this fight is pretty similar to the original, but there definitely are a few differences that put the remake head and shoulders above the original. It almost seemed a bit too easy in the original, even though his hits did a lot of damage. There was also a healthy amount of healing items in the shed in the original. The remake just made it feel more intense and urgent. In the original, it felt more like a bump in the road, especially without the chase scene, which made the village leader of all these dudes that have been harassing you for hours seem more like a common lame enemy. But like I said, the original just seemed a bit easier than the remake. If you got a few good shots in on the original, he would go on to his next form. In the original, it seemed a little more cheap. He would just kind of shoot around like a flea on Adderall. So it kind of got annoying after a certain point. Like Gigante, the remake gave it a nice balance. It really tightened up the aspects of this fight that were weak in the original. This is another one of those bosses that are pretty similar to the original, but it's improved in small ways that really make a difference. This is another iconic fight. Once again, I'll say this is definitely another 4 out of 5 Leon heads for the original as well as the remake. After Méndez, the bosses get a little weird. Now it's time for the double Gigante. Unlike the singular Gigante, the second fight with the duo is much more tedious and hectic. The area just seems too small for 2 Gigantes, especially in the original. And even after using the pit to take down one, it just doesn't give off the same effect as the first Gigante. It feels more like a bullet sponge boss with little to no reaction to anything you do. It feels like if you took the health and variety of the first Gigante and split it in half. It doesn't rip apart the stage and do super dynamic things like the first. This one just didn't seem as special. It just felt like an ultimate bullet sponge to drain all of my inventory savings before the real next boss. Though in the remake, it's a lot better. The fact that Luis is there really makes it less frustrating and more fun. This is basically the only real duo fight in the game and is super fun. The area also seems a bit more open in the remake, making it less of an overall clusterfuck. And while there aren't a lot of changes here, what they did change really worked out, because in the original, this fight sucked. You could hardly move, it just felt like you're getting shit on by these 2 monster enemies. And while that might be the effect they were going for at the time, it just doesn't really work well. The remake feels far more cohesive and is very fun, and adding Luis into this fight really did a lot to make it better. Overall, I would say there's probably about a 2 out of 5 Leon heads in the original. And for the remake side of things, I would say it's a 3 out of 5 Leon heads. Not perfect, but it's pretty good. Now, let's move on to one of the most changed bosses in the game, Salazar. In the original, this fight was really dragged out. It's probably the spongiest boss in the game, and I would say it's probably the worst boss to have that much HP. The remake is head and shoulders above the original when it comes to the Salazar fight. It's way more dynamic and flat out creepy, and the dialogue is far more interesting. I would say about 50% or more of the original fight is fighting with the environment or quick time events that ruin your windows to get hits in. They are far too frequent, and only serve to drag out this mess of a boss fight even further beyond the point it should have ended. I recall saying the remake version of this fight was pretty short, but I think it's because they learned their lesson here. The remake is far better. The only good side of the QuickTime events was that it interrupted your reload animation, cutting out some of the times that would usually give Salazar a free hit. The inclusion of QuickTime events absolutely ruined this fight, and the fact that you basically shoot something that stands still for the most part and does 2 to 3 moves is beyond boring. It's definitely the worst fight in the game. I'd rather fight Lago 10 times. In the remake, Salazar moves all across the arena, and it's really dynamic and very creepy. It's also way harder and not artificially difficult like the original was. In the original, it seemed like there were a lot of points where you just shoot one thing and then get free hits in and rinse and repeat, and it just wasn't really special. That wasn't the case for the remake, and it was really fun. This is one of the few bosses that was completely revamped for the remake, and it was a great choice. There was no way they could have remade this game and kept the Salazar fight as is. It absolutely needed a revamp more than any other fight in this game. I would say the original Salazar fight is a 1 out of 5 Leon heads. In the remake, I would say this is a 3 out of 5 Leon heads. Now, let's move on to one of the worst quote-unquote fights in the game. In the original, the first encounter with Krauser isn't even a fight. It's all garbage quick time events that don't even let you feel involved in the slightest. There isn't even a split second of real gameplay. This aged very poorly. The remake version is surprisingly one of the best fights in the game, and it has a very Metal Gear Solid-like vibe. The knife fight aspect is something that is unique to this fight, and for a one-off, it really felt like it was well polished and super fun. I wish it were even longer, to be honest. The story implications were also really cool, and a nice change from the original. There really isn't much to say about this fight, seeing as the original was just a big QuickTime event section. I think we just go and get right in the ranking here, and I'm sure you know what I'm gonna say here. The original is a 1 out of 5 Leon heads. If I could give 0, I would. In the remake, this is definitely the first 5 out of 5 Leon heads. This fight is amazing. It's difficult, and once again, it really just brings back Metal Gear Solid vibes for me, which is something we're severely lacking nowadays. Now let's move on to the second Krauser fight. Well, I mean the first for the original. The remake and the original version of this fight are a bit similar, and it's for good reason. The original actually had an odd puzzle aspect to it while Krauser hunts you down. It's fun, and it makes you feel like he's lurking around every corner. The only thing that's annoying is that he seemingly appears out of nowhere and just teleports next to you. The final showdown when Krauser transforms in the original was decently fun, but it could have used a bit more polish. The timer added somewhat unnecessary urgency, but it kind of helped it feel a bit more intense. In the remake, they actually changed Krauser's design a bit to give the fight more room to have more variation. There's more sneaking sections in the remake version, and you don't have to deal with the timer, thankfully. The fight feels way more balanced and fun in the remake, and it was already easily the best fight in the original. The openings were also a bit less frustrating in the remake, and the emotional overlying tone added a lot of depth to the remake fight. It just felt like there was more pressure and urgency, even without the timer. It really feels like you're fighting your equal in the remake. The original also relied a lot on QuickTime events, which thankfully the remake doesn't. Though, the QuickTime events work the best in this fight compared to all the other bosses. It's annoying and unnecessary still, but it wasn't too bad in the original. In the remake, this encounter becomes an absolutely perfect boss fight, without the unnecessary use of QuickTime events. Overall, in the original, compared to all the other bosses, I would say this is still a 5 out of 5 Leon heads. And in the remake, this is also obviously still a 5 out of 5 Leon heads. But now, let's move on to the final boss of Resident Evil 4. The original and remake of this fight are pretty similar, except the remake had more dynamic set pieces and movements. The fight was far longer and more difficult in the remake, and even had an extra section to add even more depth. The eyeballs in particular were more annoying in the original. One shot would down Sadler, and it would give you free hits. At that point, it was basically just rinse and repeat. It just felt super basic in the original, and it reminded me of the worst boss in the game, Salazar. Thankfully though, there aren't QuickTime events every 5 seconds like the Salazar fight. He mostly just did a couple swipes and barely moved. It's super disappointing for a final boss, and Leon didn't even get to have his cool anime moment and stab Sadler in the eye. I mean, come on. It just felt very archaic, and it was outshined by most of the other bosses in the remake and the original. Still though, the remake made changes that made this fight far more fun. And while it still isn't great compared to some of the other fights in the remake, it's certainly better than it was before. So that's a plus. Overall, this boss fight isn't the best, but the remake did what it could to make it decent. I mean, you can't cut the final boss after all. I would say in the original, I would give this a solid 2 out of 5 Leon heads. In the remake, I would say it's a 3 out of 5 Leon heads. But yeah guys, that's my boss comparison for Resident Evil 4. What bosses do you guys think are better in the original, and what bosses do you think are better in the remake? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. I've got a lot more cool content coming soon, so stay tuned for that. If you're new to the channel, why not subscribe and share my channel with a friend? I'd really appreciate it. I hope you all have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you guys soon. Peace.